Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. The letter came 2 days after my grandmother's funeral. It was a thin envelope, the kind you find stuck between the cracks of old furniture and houses that haven't seen daylight in years. My heart skipped as I recognized the handwriting. Grandma's neat, precise scrawl. For Sophie after I'm gone. The paper inside smelled of mothballs and forgotten memories. When I first saw the house, I knew it would be perfect. Elmwood Hill was quiet, tucked away from the world like a forgotten dream. The house, though weathered and worn, had a charm to it that pulled me in. Rustic, with ivy crawling up the sides like nature's attempt to claim back what it had lost. It was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor. Perfect, I thought, for writing. No distractions. No interruptions. I moved in on a cool autumn evening, the wind howling through the trees, and unpacked the remnants of my life. Old books, a typewriter, and clothes I had no intention of ever wearing. My grandmother had been the only family I had left, and now, as her heir, I was the one to inherit her solitude. It felt strange, this house, with its creaky floors and dark corners. Yet there was a part of me that relished the stillness, the quiet that seemed to embrace me. It felt like I was finally free of the noise of the world. The first night was uneventful. I settled into my room on the second floor, feeling the weight of the house's history pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, as if the walls themselves knew secrets I was too afraid to ask about. I brushed it off. It was just the house settling, I told myself. Just old wood groaning under its own weight. But then, just after midnight, I heard it. Soft footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. A creak of floorboards. I froze. My heart raced, and I strained to listen. It wasn't the house settling. These were footsteps. Someone walking around in the attic. I swallowed hard, convincing myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe a mouse. After all, the house was old. It creaked, it groaned. I was just being paranoid. The footsteps stopped after a few moments, and I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I told myself it was all in my head, that I'd get used to it. But the following nights proved me wrong. The sounds persisted. Footsteps, knocking, and sometimes even soft whispers, as if the house itself was speaking to me in some forgotten language. Something about it felt off. The silence was too thick, too heavy to ignore. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The first thing I noticed was the missing book. It was a collection of poetry that my grandmother had left me, tattered and worn but dear to my heart. I remembered placing it on the coffee table in the living room, yet when I returned after dinner it was gone. I searched every inch of the house, opening every drawer, checking under the cushions, but it was nowhere to be found. At first, I thought I had simply misplaced it. After all, I was tired, and the house was vast, its rooms filled with all sorts of relics from a time long past. But then things began to go missing more frequently. Small things at first. A pen, a pair of socks, a hairpin. It was as if the house was slowly stealing them away, piece by piece. I couldn't explain it, but the unease grew. Each time I searched and came up empty-handed, it felt like a small victory for whatever was hiding in the shadows. The attic door creaked each time I passed it. I tried to avoid looking at it, but the pull was undeniable. It felt like something was waiting for me up there. A presence, perhaps, or maybe just my own fears manifesting. But that night, something changed. The air in the house felt heavier, thicker, as though it was charged with some unseen force. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were different. The pace was quicker, more frantic, as if whoever, or whatever, was up there was moving with purpose. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening, heart pounding in my chest. The noise was unmistakable now. Quick steps followed by a loud thud, then silence. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind, I heard something I hadn't expected. A whisper. A voice, faint but clear, calling my name. "Sophie," it said. I gasped and backed away, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? It wasn't possible. I wasn't alone in this house, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to be. I had to check. I had to know what was happening. But the moment I stepped toward the attic door, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The whispers stopped. The footsteps ceased. The next morning, I found the footprints in the dust. They were small, too small to be my own, and they led straight to the attic door. I stood there, staring at the trail, my breath catching in my throat. I had locked the attic door before going to bed, and yet, somehow, the footprints appeared as if someone had been walking around up there in the night. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out what was going on. The decision to confront whatever was lurking in the attic felt like the right one, but the closer I got to the door, the more my resolve wavered. My mind raced with thoughts. Could it be a squatter, someone sneaking in through the old, rotting roof? Or perhaps a trick of my tired imagination? Whatever it was, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled with the certainty that something was terribly wrong. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door as if willing it to open on its own. My hand hovered over the brass handle, but before I could turn it, I heard a sound that froze me in place. A rustling like branches scraping against glass. I turned toward the window at the end of the hall, the one overlooking the overgrown yard and distant tree line. At first, I saw nothing. Just the moonlight casting long shadows across the lawn. But then I caught a movement, too quick to be natural. A figure just beyond my line of sight, moving with a strange, jerky gait. My heart slammed against my ribs and my breath caught in my throat. I pressed my hand against the glass, trying to get a clearer view, but whoever, or whatever, was out there had already moved. I rushed to the front door and yanked it open, my pulse pounding in my ears. The night air hit me like a cold slap, and the wind carried the scent of pine and earth. I glanced around frantically, my eyes scanning the darkness, but the yard was empty. There was nothing but the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I walked out onto the porch, my steps hesitant but determined. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to forget about whatever I'd seen, but my curiosity, or perhaps my fear, drove me forward. I crept around the house, eyes darting toward every corner, every shadow. The feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. Suddenly, I heard it again. The same rustling, followed by a soft scrape against the window above the attic. My stomach lurched. I had to know what was causing it. I jogged around to the back of the house, and as I turned the corner, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing at the base of the roof, was a figure. A man, his face hidden in the shadows, but his body hunched and stiff. He was scratching at the attic window, his nails dragging across the glass with an eerie, unrelenting rhythm. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet were frozen to the ground. And then, as if sensing my presence, the man stopped. He turned slowly, and though I couldn't see his face, I could feel his eyes on me. Cold, calculating, and wild. "Who are you?" I whispered, though my voice barely reached my own ears. But he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and vanished into the darkness, disappearing into the woods that surrounded the house. I stood there for a long moment, the silence of the night pressing in around me. Was I going crazy? Had I imagined it? Or was someone really out there, watching me, waiting? I didn't know, but I was sure of one thing now. The attic wasn't the only place something strange was hiding. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and dread. My mind couldn't stop replaying the image of the man, his twisted, unnerving presence on the roof. Each time I passed by the attic door, my pulse quickened. Every creak of the house seemed to grow louder, the whispers in the air growing more distinct, as if the walls themselves were conspiring to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I spent the entire morning searching the grounds for any trace of the man, but I found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a break-in. It was as if he had never been there at all. I returned to the house feeling a strange mix of relief and confusion. Maybe it had all been my imagination, a product of isolation, and too many late nights spent staring out the window into the darkness. But that evening, something shifted. I sat down at my grandmother's old wooden desk, the one she'd used for writing letters when I was a child. It felt familiar, comforting in its age. I began typing, but the words seemed to resist me, the silence of the house pressing down like a weight on my chest. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't focus. That's when I heard it again. The scratching, faint but unmistakable. It came from the attic, the same rhythm as before, a slow, deliberate scrape against the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I shot out of my chair, moving toward the stairs without thinking. I had to know what was causing it. I had to face it. I reached the door to the attic and hesitated. The handle was cold, and as I gripped it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, musty space beyond. The light from the hallway barely reached the far corners of the attic, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move as I stepped inside. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and for a moment everything seemed still. But then I saw it. A shape just beyond my line of sight. A figure crouched in the far corner of the attic, hunched over something. I couldn't see his face, but the shape was unmistakable. The same man. He hadn't heard me. I stood frozen, watching him as he moved around the attic, his hands shifting through the dust and debris on the floor. It was as if he were searching for something he couldn't find. His movements were erratic, jerky, and I felt my heart race in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I took a step forward, and the floorboard creaked beneath my foot. He turned sharply, his eyes wide with panic, as if he had been caught. But instead of running, he simply stared at me, a strange look of recognition in his gaze. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his voice low and harsh, like a growl from deep within his chest. "She's still here. She's still here, and you're not her." His words sent a jolt of fear through me. My grandmother. He thought I was someone else. Someone from his past. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. But he didn't answer. Instead, he lunged at me, his hands reaching for me with a desperation that sent me stumbling backward. I crashed into a stack of old boxes, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short gasps as I rushed toward the door. I managed to slam the door shut, the lock clicking into place just as I heard him pound against the other side. I backed away, my heart racing. This was no longer just about strange noises or missing objects. This was real. Someone was living in my grandmother's house, and he wasn't going to leave quietly. The days following the confrontation in the attic were a blur of anxiety and dread. I barely slept, barely ate. My thoughts kept returning to the man. His wild eyes, the frantic way he searched the attic, his words that echoed in my mind. "She's still here." Who was he talking about? My grandmother? It couldn't be. She had been gone for months. But the look in his eyes, the way he seemed to recognize me. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone. I kept the attic door locked, but that didn't seem to stop the man. The scratching continued, louder now, and I could hear him pacing above me, mumbling to himself in a language I didn't understand. His voice was a constant presence, the low murmur drifting down through the old wood beams like a haunting whisper. I couldn't escape it. One evening, after days of silence, I saw him again. He was standing at the window, just outside the house, his face pressed against the glass. I had no idea how long he had been there. The sight of him, his shadowy figure staring into the darkness, sent a chill through me. I froze, staring back at him. He didn't move, didn't blink. It was like he was waiting for something to happen, like he was expecting me to do something. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed away from the window, my breath shallow. I had to do something. I couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a house with a man I didn't know, with the sound of his whispers always in the background. I needed to confront him, to figure out who he was and why he was here. But fear gripped me at the thought of opening the door again. I waited until the moon rose high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the house. That's when I saw it. A shadow slipping through the trees, moving too quickly, too deliberately. It was him. I grabbed a flashlight and shoved my feet into boots, determined to face whatever madness had taken root in the house. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, and moved toward the tree line. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what was going on. As I approached the edge of the woods, I saw the figure again, standing in the clearing, his back to me. This time, I could see more clearly. A man, tall and gaunt, his clothes ragged and torn. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, his hands hanging limply at his sides. His hair was matted, his face hidden in shadow. "Why are you here?" I called out, my voice shaking but loud enough to carry. He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned toward me, his eyes wide, vacant. "You don't belong here," he repeated, his voice hoarse and distant. "She's still here. She's still watching." I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me as his words sank in. "She's still watching." My grandmother. Before I could speak, the man took a step forward. His movements were jerky, unnatural. And then, in a blur, he lunged at me, his hands reaching out like claws. I screamed, stumbling backward as he grabbed at my sleeve. His fingers dug into my skin, sending a jolt of terror through my body. I didn't think. I just reacted. I kicked out, connecting with his chest, and he stumbled back, releasing his grip. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, hearing his labored breathing behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I bolted into the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. My mind raced, heart pounding in my chest. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But the thought of leaving the house was just as terrifying as staying. The man, whoever he was, wasn't just a stranger. He was something more, something dangerous. And he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The fear was a constant weight on my chest, suffocating me with every breath. The man, the one who claimed my grandmother was still here, was growing more erratic with each passing day. The scratching had turned into banging, heavy and relentless, as if he were trying to break through the attic door. I kept it locked, but I could feel him just on the other side, waiting, watching. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know the truth. What was going on in this house? Why had he come here, and what did he want from me? The tension was unbearable, and my mind couldn't rest. It was as if the house itself was alive, its walls closing in on me with every passing hour. I decided to confront him once and for all. There was no other choice. But this time, I wouldn't just wait for him to come to me. I was going to find him first. I armed myself with the only thing I could think of. My grandmother's old walking stick, thick and solid. I wasn't sure if it would do much, but it was better than nothing. I made my way through the house, each step heavier than the last. The silence in the house was suffocating, like the air itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the faint scrape of my shoes on the floor and the distant pounding coming from above. I reached the attic door and stood there for a moment, gathering my courage. I had no idea what I was about to face, but I knew I couldn't back down now. Slowly, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The attic was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. The faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the roof was the only source of illumination. And then I saw him. Sitting in the corner, his face hidden in the shadows. His body was slumped, his hands resting in his lap as if he were waiting for something. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, my grip tightening on the walking stick. I didn't know what to say, what to do. But then he spoke. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice low and strained. "You've made a mistake." His words sent a chill down my spine. There was something almost familiar about his voice, but I couldn't place it. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the first time I saw them clearly. Wild, haunted eyes filled with madness. But there was something else too. Something almost pleading. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound strong. He smiled, a twisted, broken thing. "I used to live here. This was my home. With my mother. She never left, not really. And now, neither will I." I frowned, confused. "Your mother? What are you talking about?" He stood up suddenly, his movements jerky and erratic. "She's still here," he whispered. "In the walls, in the attic, watching." It hit me like a ton of bricks. The man wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had once lived here, someone tied to the house in ways I didn't understand. But there was more to it than that. I could feel it in my bones. The truth was much darker, much more twisted than I had imagined. He stepped toward me, his hands trembling. "I was never supposed to leave," he said. "She made sure of that. She kept me here, kept me safe. But now you're here, and you're not supposed to be." The pieces started falling into place. His obsession with my grandmother, his belief that she was still alive. He had never left the house. He had been living in the attic for months, hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone to find him. Waiting for someone to take his place. I couldn't let him control me. I couldn't let him win. With a surge of adrenaline, I swung the walking stick at him, knocking him back into the corner. He howled in pain, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The man scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with fear and fury. "You're not supposed to be here," he screamed, his voice rising to a crescendo of madness. I backed away, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "No, you don't get to do this. This isn't your home anymore." In that moment, I realized that the house, my grandmother's house, wasn't just a place of memories. It was a prison. A place that held the man captive, a place that had driven him to madness. I called the authorities, but it was already too late. The man had vanished into the woods, leaving behind only the echoes of his madness in the walls of the house. As a minor busy with school, I have never used Reddit, but what happened a few days ago needs to be discussed. I had just gotten back from school and was resting at home after a long day. I was on the couch watching TV and I was home alone. It was around 9:45 p.m. My sister was at her friend's house, my brother was out drinking, and my mom was at her friend's house. As the youngest, I couldn't be out past 9. I was watching funny videos while working on an assignment for school. About 30 minutes in, I started hearing a sound that was kind of like a dog's yelp, but with a mix of a coyote's yip. I was very confused as I was in the middle of our city, nowhere near the woods. My neighbors have dogs, but this was no normal dog. Their dog is a German shepherd with a deep bark, so I knew it wasn't any dog I was familiar with. Confused, I stood up and went to the window. I moved the curtains a bit and peeked outside. No one in my apartment complex was awake, or at least making those kinds of sounds. I was eating some cereal because I was too lazy to cook anything, and there was nothing outside except the occasional passing car. The sound stopped after about 10-15 minutes, so I went back to watching my show and working on my assignment. Around 11:12 p.m., the sound started up again. This time, I looked out the back window, as that's where it seemed to be coming from. I have poor eyesight, and I normally experience hallucinations due to schizophrenia, so I thought that's what it was. But this time, it didn't stop. I got up again and looked back outside. I think I saw movement, but I'm not sure. Right as I looked outside, the sound stopped. I sat back down, and then it started again. This time, it seemed to be moving, almost as if it was circling the complex at an inhuman speed. Our complex is huge, and it would take at least 2 minutes to get from one side to the other. It was as if there were more than one of whatever it was, moving to different places at the same time. At this point, I was feeling a bit anxious. I looked out both windows, but there was nothing. It was as if nothing was there at all. The sounds went on and off the whole night for a good 6 hours. I stayed up all night, worried something was going on. In the morning, I asked my neighbors if they had heard it too. Turns out they did. So, I'm not hallucinating, right? I had never thought much about settling down. Life had always been busy, filled with constant movement and deadlines that never seemed to slow down. At 32, I decided it was time to take a step back and live somewhere that didn't remind me of the endless grind of the city. A small suburban apartment, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. It was a far cry from the constant noise and urgency I'd grown accustomed to. My new apartment was simple. Bare walls, a cozy living space, and a view of the street. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I worked as a consultant for a tech firm, which allowed me the flexibility to work from home. The first few weeks passed in a blur of routine. Mornings spent at my desk, evenings relaxing on the couch, and weekends devoted to small tasks around the apartment. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I welcomed it. It was during those early days that I first noticed him. Mr. Spencer, the neighbor in the unit across from mine. He wasn't particularly striking, just a man in his late 50s, graying hair, and an air of quiet mystery. At first, I thought little of him. He was just another neighbor. But there was something unsettling about the way he always seemed to be watching. It started innocuously enough. He'd appear by his window, staring out into the street, seemingly lost in thought. I thought nothing of it. He was probably just passing the time, I assumed. But after a while, it felt different. His gaze would linger just a little too long. I found myself glancing over, catching his eyes staring back at me. I'd quickly look away, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after I turned back to whatever I was doing. It wasn't just his staring that got to me. There were moments when I could feel his presence in the hallway outside my apartment. I'd hear footsteps in the hall at odd hours, footsteps that never seemed to match the rhythm of anyone else's walking. My curiosity started to grow, though I wasn't ready to admit that something felt off. One night, as I was settling in after a long day, I received a message on my phone. It was a simple text, no number attached, just the words, "I've been waiting for you." A shiver ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it was nothing more than a prank. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. "I know when you leave," the next one read. The words sent a wave of unease through me. It couldn't be a coincidence. The realization hit me hard. Mr. Spencer wasn't just another quirky neighbor. He was watching me, and I didn't know why. The messages didn't stop. They kept coming, each more disturbing than the last, and I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself it was all just a coincidence, that there was no way Mr. Spencer was really watching me this closely. But deep down, I knew the truth. He was obsessed. It wasn't just the messages anymore. I began to notice things out of place in my apartment. Small things at first. A chair slightly shifted, a book moved from the shelf where I was sure I'd left it. But the most unsettling part, it was the feeling that someone had been in my space. The apartment no longer felt like mine. The worst part was when I realized Mr. Spencer wasn't just watching me. He was getting into my apartment. I'd leave for work in the mornings, and by the time I came home, things would be subtly different. It was as if he was moving through my life, taking pieces of it and rearranging them. I wasn't sure how he was getting in, but it became impossible to ignore. The next time I left for a business trip, I decided to test my theory. I deliberately left a few small items in place that I knew I'd be able to identify later. I also set up a camera, a small one I'd used for personal security, and hid it in a corner where it wouldn't be obvious. The following week, I returned to a scene I had hoped I wouldn't find. The camera had captured everything. I watched, heart pounding, as Mr. Spencer entered my apartment while I was gone. He moved through my space with a disturbing familiarity, rifling through my things, looking through drawers, and touching everything. I froze in place, the weight of what I was seeing crashing down on me. He wasn't just a curious neighbor. He had been inside my home in my most private moments. When I confronted him, I tried to keep my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "Mr. Spencer, I know what's been going on," I said, my words barely above a whisper. He smiled, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. "I'm just keeping you safe," he said, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. "I've been watching you for your own protection. You never know what's out there. You're welcome." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I wondered if he was truly insane, or if I was just imagining everything. But then I saw something that changed everything. Hidden cameras, small and meticulously placed, were scattered around my apartment. Not just one or two, but dozens. Mr. Spencer wasn't just a neighbor. He was a predator, a stalker with an elaborate plan that went far beyond mere obsession, and I was the target. I was sick to my stomach. The cameras, the messages, the strange items in my apartment. All of it had pointed to something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. I had to know more. I needed to understand what Mr. Spencer had been doing in my life, how far his reach extended. But the more I dug, the more I uncovered a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and violence. I took to researching Mr. Spencer. His apartment was as empty of personal details as mine, but the few things I managed to find made my blood run cold. He had been living in the building for years, but there was no record of him ever working, no family or friends listed. He had a history of strange behavior, but nothing concrete. Just rumors and whispers from neighbors who had moved away, too scared to stick around. The deeper I went, the more I began to piece together a horrifying picture. Mr. Spencer wasn't just some isolated neighbor with a quirky obsession. He had been stalking and eliminating men just like me. Loners, people who lived quiet, solitary lives. He'd target them, watch them for months, even years, learning their routines and entering their homes when they were away. And then, when they grew too attached or started to notice him, he would help them by ending their loneliness in the most twisted way imaginable, by killing them. It was almost like a strange, sickened form of romance in his mind. He didn't just want to watch me, he wanted to be my protector. In his warped view, the only way to save me from loneliness was to eliminate me, to free me from the life I had built. His messages were no longer just random thoughts. They were his twisted way of trying to lure me into his trap. I couldn't let that happen. I needed to leave, to get out of this building and away from him. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Mr. Spencer wouldn't let me go so easily. He'd been planning this for too long, and I was just one more piece in his insane puzzle. One night, as I sat in my apartment, staring at the hidden cameras he had installed, I made a decision. I had to confront him, had to face him head-on before he could take the next step in his twisted plan. I couldn't just wait around to become another statistic. I left my apartment, feeling the weight of every step I took as I headed to Mr. Spencer's unit. My heart raced, and my mind swirled with questions. What was he planning for me? Was I already too late? The answers didn't matter anymore. I had to stop him, or I wouldn't make it out alive. I stood outside Mr. Spencer's door, my hand hovering over the knob. My mind raced, flooded with possibilities. What was I walking into? Was this a confrontation, or was it something much darker? Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when I had come this far. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the faint creak echoing in the empty hallway. Inside, the apartment was just as I remembered it. Clean, orderly, and devoid of anything that would suggest a life outside the walls. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air felt thick, charged with a sense of impending danger. Mr. Spencer wasn't in the living room, so I moved through the apartment slowly, my eyes darting from corner to corner. My ears strained for any sound, but everything was eerily silent. The deeper I moved into his space, the more the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I knew he was here. I could feel his presence. Then I heard it. The softest shuffle of footsteps behind me. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around. But it wasn't Mr. Spencer. It was the door. The one that led to a small hallway. I hadn't noticed it before, hidden behind a bookshelf. And as I took a step toward it, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. This was it. The trap. The door clicked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. I hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The walls were lined with photographs. Dozens of them, all of me. They were taken from different angles at different times, but they were all unmistakably mine. My face, my every move, caught on film. It was like a nightmare come to life. And there, in the corner, sitting in the shadows, was Mr. Spencer. He looked calm, almost serene, as if this was all perfectly normal. He was sitting in front of a desk, and on that desk there was a single photograph. A picture of me, printed in black and white, marked with a red X over my face. "You shouldn't have come here, Tom," he said, his voice low and smooth, like he was speaking to a child. "I told you I was keeping you safe." I couldn't speak. The room closed in around me, the air thick with a suffocating realization that I had walked right into the lion's den. Mr. Spencer's eyes never left mine, and in that moment, I knew I was no longer in control. I was just another part of his twisted plan. His words hung in the air, their meaning sinking in slowly. "Keeping me safe?" I asked, trying to steady my breathing, but my voice came out hoarse, like I hadn't spoken in days. "You've been stalking me, spying on me. You've been in my apartment. This isn't protection. It's obsession. It's madness." Mr. Spencer's eyes flickered, a brief flash of irritation crossing his face before the calm returned. "You're wrong, Tom. You don't understand. I'm doing this for you. For your own good. You're lonely, and I'm saving you from that." His smile widened, revealing more of his twisted rationale. "I've watched you, and I know what you need. You'll thank me eventually." I shook my head, the overwhelming sense of dread threatening to choke me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But I was paralyzed, trapped in his web, unable to move. The room felt suffocating, the photographs of my every move mocking me from the walls. Then, with a sudden motion, he stood up, his calm demeanor slipping as he reached for something on the desk. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized it was a knife. Long, sharp, and glinting in the low light. "It's time, Tom. You'll see soon enough. I'm just doing what's necessary," he said, his voice almost gentle. Adrenaline surged through me, sharp and cold. I couldn't let him do this. I couldn't become another one of his victims. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room was small, the only exit behind me, and I couldn't outrun him. I needed something, anything, to defend myself. I scanned the room quickly. There, near the desk, was a heavy lamp. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it toward him, hoping for any distraction. It hit him square in the chest, knocking him back with a grunt. The knife flew from his hand, skidding across the floor, but he wasn't down for long. He was faster than I expected, charging at me with terrifying precision. I ducked, narrowly avoiding his grip, and shoved him back with everything I had. My hands found the knife, and in that moment, everything went still. I was no longer the victim. I was fighting for my life. With a trembling hand, I raised the blade, but I didn't know if I had the strength to finish what had begun. You don't have to do this, Mr. Spencer said, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos. You can still come with me. We can be together. I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you're never lonely again. His words were a twisted lullaby, and for a split second, I almost believed him. But then I saw the knife in my hand, the blood dripping from his arm, and the reality crashed down on me. This was no romance. It was survival. With one final push, I ran, breaking free from his grip and bolting for the door. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I heard him shouting behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I reached the exit, burst through the door, and didn't stop running until I was outside. The building loomed behind me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had escaped. But as I ran, I realized the horror wasn't over. Mr. Spencer hadn't just been stalking me. He had been grooming me for something far worse. Something far darker. And even though I was free, I knew this wasn't the last time I'd encounter him. The true horror had only just begun. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest police station. My legs were burning and my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't care. I burst through the door, nearly collapsing as I ran up to the front desk. My voice came out in ragged gasps as I tried to explain what had happened. You have to help me, I said, choking on the words. There's a man, a neighbor. He's been watching me. He's been in my apartment. He's trying to kill me. The officer behind the desk looked at me with confusion before registering the panic in my voice. He stood up and quickly motioned for another officer to join him. Within minutes, I was in an interrogation room, surrounded by detectives, my story spilling out in a blur of fear and adrenaline. I told them everything, the messages, the photographs, the hidden cameras, and the confrontation with Mr. Spencer. But they didn't seem as shocked as I expected. There's more to this story, Tom, one of the detectives said, his voice grim. We've been investigating Mr. Spencer for a while now. He's been linked to several disappearances in the area over the past few years. Men who lived alone, who vanished without a trace. We had no solid evidence until now. I sat there stunned. Mr. Spencer was more than just an obsessed neighbor. He was a serial killer, a predator who had been picking off men like me, using his sick obsession to lure them in before eliminating them. And I had almost been his next victim. The police told me they had already been watching him, but they had no idea how deep his game ran. They had no idea he was living right next door to me, or that he had been grooming me for months. The thought made my stomach twist. The horror of it was overwhelming. Later that night, they raided Mr. Spencer's apartment, and the truth of what they found was even worse than I had feared. They uncovered more photographs, more journals filled with chilling accounts of his obsession with his victims. They found recordings of his conversations with them, his manipulative, delusional attempts to convince them they were better off dead. And there, in the hidden corners of his apartment, were more tools of torture. Knives, ropes, and worse. Mr. Spencer was arrested that night, but it was only the beginning. As the investigation deepened, the full extent of his crimes began to emerge. He had been operating in plain sight, hiding in the shadows of a quiet suburban neighborhood, stalking his prey without ever raising suspicion. He was a master manipulator, able to blend into society while living a double life as a predator. But the damage was done. I was safe, yes, but I would never feel the same. The memories of what happened, the fear, the violence, the realization that I had been nothing more than a pawn in his sick game, would haunt me forever. Keep in mind, this was years before my friend's story, or the ones I have researched. I want to share this for context. My dad was a truck driver when he left the military in the late 2000s. By the time my siblings and I were born, he only drove within our home state of Texas, and summers were extremely busy for him. This incident happened in 2006 on one of his extended trips across Texas. I believe he was driving south on 281. He was getting pretty tired when he pulled into a truck stop. As he was heading toward the on-site convenience store, he noticed a young woman pacing back and forth at the front of the shop. She appeared to be in her early 20s, slim, very pretty, and wearing a tank top with cut-off shorts according to my dad, which is normal attire for Texas summers. She was carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil, as if she had just come from a family BBQ. He finished his business in the store and headed back to his truck. As he got in, he was stunned to see that the blonde woman was now sitting in his passenger seat. He was utterly shocked. He had no clue who this woman was or how she had gotten past his locked door. My dad was always very vigilant on the road and never left his truck unlocked. He demanded that she get out of his truck. At that point, he wasn't afraid, but something about this mysterious woman felt off. She just sat there, staring at him, with the covered plate on her lap, not saying a word. For a moment, he wondered if he should just get out, walk over to the passenger side, and yank her out of the cab. But he decided against it, though he wasn't sure why. The whole thing was beyond strange. So, against his better judgment, my dad turned the rig on and drove off, with the blonde woman still sitting in his passenger seat. A few miles up the road, he tried to make conversation, perhaps to quell the extreme discomfort he was feeling. He asked her name, but she remained silent. As he continued down the highway, lustful thoughts began to creep into his mind. It had probably been a while since he'd seen my mother, and out there on the rural Texas roads, who would know? Just this once, what could happen, right? My dad placed his hand on her thigh, just above her knee. As soon as he touched her, the woman turned from a gorgeous young woman into some kind of hellish monster. Her face became rugged, and her eyes turned into black pits. Her teeth became sharp fangs, and her tongue grew long and unnatural. The demonic figure let out a hiss. From the plate she was holding came a mass of writhing movements, as if there were a pile of worms underneath the foil. A putrid smell filled the truck's cab. My dad quickly turned his face away from her and managed to bring the truck to a stop on the side of the road. As the truck came to a halt, my dad opened the door and jumped out. After taking a few moments to compose himself and let his breathing return to normal, he looked back at the truck. The demonic woman had vanished. He was now alone on the road. He started praying, asking God to rebuke the evil spirit. He eventually got back into his truck and drove off. The woman did not return, but it took a while for the lingering stench to dissipate. When my dad got home from that trip, he recounted everything to my mother. He was so scared, fearing my mother would forgive him for his unfaithful indiscretion. He had seen a lot in his life, but nothing had ever frightened him like that before. He blamed himself for the impure thoughts, and perhaps that's why he attracted the evil spirit. I know many might say that everyone cheats on their partners all the time, and nothing like this happens to them. I can't explain why. I only know what happened to my dad on the dark, lonely roads of Texas. When I was older, I brought up this experience and asked, "Dad, did that really happen to you?" He never responded with words. He just nodded. I've never posted anything on here before, and I've stopped telling people about my experiences because I had always gotten the "you-ha." Changes the subject immediately. Reaction. I guess I'm just not sure what to do with these experiences. I feel like they are decently significant, and I can't forget them or make them stop happening. Not that I want to necessarily. It's gotten much less frequent, and it's not like it really bothers me or anything, but it's such an inherent part of my daily existence. I will add, I was in a very severe car accident almost 15 years ago, pedestrian versus vehicle, and I had pretty severe head trauma amongst other bodily injuries. This incident hasn't left me with many lasting side effects other than vertigo, tinnitus, and some issues with mental focus, something only I and one or two people very close to me have noticed, just because we know how mentally sharp I was before, and I can recall the paranormal events with the same clarity as before the accident. So I don't believe that has had any impact on my memories of these happenings. A little background. I am 29 female, and I grew up in a crummy little town in Northern California where I spent ages 1 to 10 years old. My parents have been divorced since before I can remember. I have no memories of them together, so I grew up floating between the two households. I lived with my mom during the time these events occurred and would see my dad every other weekend. I remember being very attached to my mom, as most small children tend to be, especially in split households, and I would typically end up sleeping in her bed most nights. I was probably 2 or 3 when my first stepdad came into the picture, and he of course wanted to put a stop to the bed sharing. He worked a pretty stressful job with long hours and didn't need a wiggly toddler messing with his sleep schedule. And as a parent now myself, I totally get it. I recall that I didn't take very well to it initially. I would wake up in the middle of the night, go to my mom's room, which was directly across the hall from mine, try the doorknob and find it locked. I would just sit there and knock until either my mom came and got me, or sometimes my stepdad would tell me to go back to my own room. At one point, my stepdad sat me down and had a conversation with me about how I needed to stay in bed, unless it was an emergency. We all needed to get as much sleep as we could to stay healthy and have energy to go to work and school and play, etc. So I got the hint, and eventually I was able to stay asleep through the night. And I wanted to make sure no one got sick or tired because I was waking them up in the night. So even if I did wake up, I did everything I could to fall back asleep and stay in bed. The house we lived in had always given me some bad vibes. Even at such a young age, I could just tell that there was something wrong with it. It felt heavy inside, and just about any time I turned a corner or entered another room, it felt like there was going to be someone or something waiting for me. Having our dog Zephyr had helped a bit. He was a Rhodesian Ridgeback. They are a larger breed, pretty muscular, very loyal, protective, and intelligent. He slept in my room at the foot of my bed most of the time. The first encounter I experienced was when I was probably 4 or 5 years old, and at this point I had developed a solid sleeping pattern and rarely woke up throughout the night. I remember waking up, like my whole body was just wide awake. I was completely alert out of a dead sleep. I looked at my digital clock on my nightstand and saw it was 2:14 a.m. I have no clue why I remember the exact time with such clarity. I remember just about everything about the entire scene in vivid detail, as a matter of fact, and I just kind of looked around my room wondering why I had woken up. I looked towards the foot of my bed, which was facing my open bedroom door, where I could see the small hallway and across it to my mom's closed bedroom door. The hallway light was on, which was normal, but nothing amiss. I saw Zephyr at the foot of my bed and noticed his ears were perked, and he was alert as well, with his head lifted and focused on the hallway, but still sitting down. I suddenly had a really overpowering sense of alarm come over me. My heartbeat sped up and my breathing got shallow, and I remember feeling like I needed to get out of there, out of my room at the very least, and not be alone. The sound was muffled at first, kind of like it was down the hallway and maybe coming from the garage, which was past the kitchen. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy wrapped in cloth being dragged across the floor. Then a heavy, dull thump followed by a low moan, as if someone were in pain. But it wasn't clear. It was like if someone had something covering their mouth. I sat there in my bed, trying to understand what I was hearing, or if I was really hearing it, when I looked back at my dog. He stood up on my bed immediately, hackles raised, and growling with teeth bared towards my open door. This dog was never vocal by any means, let alone aggressive, and this reaction proved to me that I was truly experiencing what I felt and heard. I sat for a few more seconds, just stunned, I think, and I could hear the dragging, the thump, and the groan repeated, now closer towards the end of the hallway, which means it had crossed through the kitchen. I threw my covers off and ran to my doorway, where I was stopped, suddenly very frozen in fear. The noises continued, seemingly unbothered by my movement, and Zephyr had jumped down from my bed, but refused to move from that part of the room. I remember my heartbeat absolutely pounding in my ears as I tried to figure out how to take the 3 steps across the hallway and get to my mom's room without getting caught, eaten, found, by whatever was coming towards me. I heard one more muffled groan and decided to shut my eyes and just run. As I stepped into the hallway, I remember it was so cold, like a window had been left open, and it kind of caught my breath in my chest. I also remember having my entire body just flooded with a sense of, do not look down the hallway, and I listened to it. I opened one eye to make sure I didn't run into my mom's door, and thankfully it was unlocked as I barreled into her room and closed it as quickly and as quietly as I could behind me. I crawled into bed next to my mom and pulled the covers over my head, trying to calm myself down as best as I could. Eventually I fell asleep, and I didn't hear the noise anymore. I think it was about a week before I tried to tell anyone about that night. I think my mindset was, don't think about it or it will happen again. So I didn't really acknowledge it until I had some undivided attention from adults. It made me feel safer. It was my dad and his wife at the time who I ended up talking to about the whole thing. They brushed it off and suggested that it was the refrigerator or the ice maker, but with how my dog reacted, and how very clearly I could remember it all, especially the way it made me feel, I knew it was something else. I 100% had the dog by my side every night for a very long time. I started keeping my door closed or open just a crack. But as far as I can remember, that particular incident never happened again. As I grew up in that house, I still felt like there was a presence, not necessarily malicious, but definitely nothing good, more like it wanted to keep me in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety. I continued to have that feeling of expecting to see something around each corner, which did give me horrible anxiety. In fact, I remember vividly one afternoon in my after-school program in the first grade. I felt like I was lucid dreaming, like suddenly, nothing around me was real, and I couldn't wake up. I started crying and screaming and pinching my arms just to make sure I could feel it. And then another little kid went and got a teacher because he thought I had gotten stuck in the play structure I was in. Needless to say, whatever it was, it succeeded in messing with my head if that was its goal. Over that next year, my dad ended up taking Zephyr to live on the ranch he had. Zephyr was his dog to begin with. I was never quite sure why he left him with my mom in the first place. And one night, I remember not feeling well and wanting to go get my mom for some medicine. But when I opened her bedroom door, a large, dark dog snout appeared out of the darkness, and then an entire canine muzzle protruded out towards me at eye level. It was a dark brown color, long and sleek. I could even see the shine from the wetness on the nose. No teeth bared, no noises or anything particularly scary other than the indication that there was suddenly a very large dog in my mom's room. I very quickly closed the door and ran back to bed, hoping that would be the end of it for the night, and it was. My younger sister was born when I was 6, and my brother when I was 8, so there were a lot of distractions over the next few years, and I didn't notice much activity. Things got really chaotic at that house. Unfortunately, it developed into a pretty toxic relationship between my mom, stepdad, and me. So when I was 10 years old, I decided to go live with my dad on his ranch. I continued to feel paranoid and anxious, but I didn't have any more encounters like at my mom's house. Later, in my teenage years, I confided in my mom about feeling the heavy presence and very vaguely touching on that one particular encounter, and she confessed that she had always felt a presence there as well. At that point, we weren't terribly close, so I didn't press her anymore on the issue, and she never brought it up again either. My next significant encounter didn't happen until I was in my early 20s. My daughter was around. 2.5 at the time. I had recently purchased my first home, and after a year of living there, my ex-husband and I split up and had settled on me keeping the house since he didn't like the area it was in anyway. It was kind of in the mountains, and he was very much a city life person. I loved the place. The area was great with lots of hiking and lakes nearby. A great spot for a first home and plenty opportunities for getting my daughter outside. The house was 2-bed and 2-bath, a nice little porch on the back, and plenty of room for my daughter to grow into. There was something off about her room in particular though. Specifically her closet, it just made me want to not be in there for too long. Honestly, I would watch it through the video monitor that I had in her room sometimes when my daughter was with her dad. And I truly half expected to see something come out of it, for eyes to peer back at me or a hand to reach around the sliding doors. But I just chalked it up to being single for the first time in almost 10 years and readjusting to being alone. And of course my anxiety that has stuck with me since childhood. My daughter really only slept in her room. The rest of the time I made sure to have her in the kitchen with me, playing in the living room or outside digging in the dirt, planting flowers or something of the sort. Plus, nothing had happened aside from that feeling of mine, and I tried really hard to just push it away and not let it get the better of me. One day I was cleaning up, dusting the vents particularly, when I saw a bunch of colorful things in the vents connected to the wood-burning fireplace. I unscrewed the vents and found a ton of Lego pieces, a spoon, and a few other small plastic toy parts. I thought to myself, well, it's safe to say there was definitely a little kid living here at one point, as I smiled and imagined a toddler happily pushing their toys into the vent on the wall, having the time of their life, and some poor mother wondering where that spoon went. As I scooped out more of the Legos and other junk, I found a card at the very back of the pile that turned out to be a driver's license. I cleaned it off and saw that the expiration date was still a couple years away, meaning it must have been renewed fairly recently, and decided to look up the person to see if I could return it to them. It had been about a year of me owning the house, so I figured they most likely had gotten a replacement, but I was strangely curious about this person. I thought it was a little strange. The license belonged to a younger girl according to the birth date on the card, but she didn't have any social media, nothing on LinkedIn, really no internet presence at all, which I feel is pretty rare today. The only thing I could find connected to her was an old blog post. I think it was only a couple years old at the time, and she was kind of venting online about how her family had abandoned her, and they shunned her for practicing a certain belief system that is constantly misconstrued and sensationalized to be something that it's not. I don't want to name it here just because based on what she said she was doing, the rituals and summoning, I don't believe she was following practices in line with this religion, and I don't feel right associating it here. I think she may have been confused herself. I will say I ended up shredding the license and never got in touch with her. She talked about her boyfriend that she lived with and the child they had, and how they were all very happy together and better off without her judgmental family. She went on to say that she'd had a miscarriage decently late during a pregnancy, not sure if this was before or after she had the child that lived in the house with her, and she was very obviously grieving for a long time. In one post, she claimed to have summoned her lost child's spirit. I felt like this could have been connected to my strange feelings about my daughter's room, but I kind of felt like I was being paranoid, and once again didn't want to let it get the best of me. I held on to this mindset until one night I woke up to my daughter crying. It was a little louder than her usual "I'm awake" cry, so I checked the video monitor I had on my phone. I saw her standing up, holding onto the railing at the foot of her bed, looking just to the left of the monitor camera. She was crying and suddenly started screaming in a way that I had never heard before, with so much terror and fear. I watched for a second longer when she raised her arm and pointed at something, also just to the left of the monitor. I sprinted into her room, not even thinking to look at the wall near the monitor. I scooped her into my arms and asked desperately, "What's wrong? Are you okay? What is it?" She continued crying, and her arm, still raised and pointing behind me, began raising up towards the ceiling, while her eyes followed, and she was able to say through tears, "That, make it stop, that." I followed her direction and looked up where she was focused, but saw nothing. The room was so heavy though, and that closet. There was such a sinister energy with it. I took my daughter into my room, and we slept the rest of the night in my bed. The next day, I dropped her off with her dad for the weekend, and I immediately went and bought sage to burn. I had never done anything like that before, and tried to research as much as I could about how to be successful with it, so I gave it my best shot. I took an abalone shell, burned the sage, and walked through my home speaking and projecting positive energy into my space, and releasing any negative energies that may be stuck. I went into my daughter's room last, really wanting to take my time in there. My voice shrank a little, my hands shook a little, but I went on very intentionally. I wanted to really focus on that closet. I had to. As I continued speaking and moving closer to the closet, I pulled one of the sliding doors back so that I could get the sage inside that space. The words got stuck in my throat, and my breathing stopped involuntarily. On the back of that sliding door were several strange symbols, and things that looked like they might be words in different language, and then what seemed like scribbles of nonsense. I immediately cleaned off the door as best as I could, and as fast as I could, and finished up the rest of saging the room. I wish I had taken a picture or something so I could have researched what they were. It could have also been nothing but nonsense, but I suppose it's for the best either way. After the saging, the house honestly did feel lighter, and nothing ever happened like that night again. My daughter slept much better, and my mood in general seemed to improve. I ended up selling the place a couple years ago, and have since moved to a different state. And ever since then, my life has been fairly uneventful in the paranormal area. I did seem to gain this sense of premonition almost. It started when I was around 10-12 and get progressively stronger with age. It's kind of cool, kind of useful, kind of a bummer sometimes because I get very clear thoughts, almost like it's spoken to me, but in my head, just like a very confidently stated fact. I can get into that in a different post though. This has gone on for much longer than I anticipated, but it feels really good to be able to get it out in a community where these kind of events are actually given credibility. Does anyone have any idea what could have been going on in my childhood house? I went back for the first time in probably 10+ years to get some old belongings. Mom still owns it, younger brother sometimes stays in it, but otherwise it is unoccupied, and that heaviness is still very much there. I was told at one point that it was a drug house right before we moved in, and I tried Googling the address to see if there were any reports about deaths or any particularly heinous occurrences that took place, but I couldn't find anything. Also, any thoughts on the event in my daughter's room? I have no clue if it was directly related to that girl and something she may have tried, or if it was something else completely unrelated. I'm open to any theories or educated guesses because I have none. Thank you so much for taking the time to read through all of this. I truly appreciate it. It's been on my mind for a while, and I can't give you the case number or all the details since it's still being handled. My friend went missing 4 years ago, suddenly and unexpectedly. His name will be G, obviously not his real name for this. We're high schoolers in Texas, and my entire friend group is really close. We spend hours together, so one of us going missing was strange. G wasn't a loner like many missing people have been. He's always been overenthusiastic, excited, and extremely smart. In 2018, it was nearing our semester exams for the 6-week period. I had third period with G, and that was our only class together. He wasn't there. It was unexpected, but I thought maybe he was sick. We all kind of assumed that until his parents messaged me. All my friends have each other's parents' numbers for emergencies. A few of us, including me, have medical conditions. They asked if he had been accidentally marked absent in all his classes. I told them he hadn't been in third period, but I wasn't sure about the others. Within the next 6 hours, he was officially listed as missing. I've never had anything like this happen. We were all scared. I left school immediately after the last bell rang to go to his house, thinking he was just hiding or playing a prank. He didn't have a bad home life. We knew this because we spent literal hours with him every day. Sleepovers, hanging out, etc. And his parents were wonderful. Even he would say they were amazing. To cut it short, he reappeared a month ago, on November 12th, 2021. With that, we wanted every explanation he could give. Where the hell had he been for 4 years? Well, even he didn't know. Doctors said it could be amnesia, maybe a head injury, or he could have been kidnapped and escaped, but was too shocked to speak. But when we were alone, he kind of revealed something. He said he knew where he was, but it wasn't anywhere he thought someone would have ever seen. I thought he was joking, but he's been seriously sticking to this. He says there weren't any humans, it was lonely, and after a while, he kind of shut down and ended up back here 4 years later. Maybe he's joking to cope. I'll update if something new comes from this. Edit. Be skeptical if you want. That's your opinion. Details can be vague because I'd rather not disclose my exact location. And just a reminder that I'm strictly a friend, not a cop or a parent. Just a friend. So there's only so much information I have. The Airbnb was pristine. It was calm, quiet, and perfect. It was cliché in the sense that no picture could ever do it justice. Lee and I pulled up to the Airbnb and were greeted by our hosts. A smart-looking, intelligent woman of the world named Andrea and a well-dressed, charming man named Robert. The couple was probably mid-60s. Their combined languages listed on their page was over 10, and they had visited 80 countries in their time together. Even if the Airbnb hadn't looked like the quintessential getaway, Lee and I would have chosen to stay here just because of our hosts. They were kind, well-mannered, and knowledgeable. Andrea was impressed by Lee's writing skills and my fiber crafting. We shared a short dinner after our long drive with our hosts, just a quick, getting-to-know-you meal they had prepared ahead of time. Well, we'll let you get unpacked and settled, Andrea said after she had showed us our space. We had the entire lower half of the house to ourselves, and it was as spotless and calming as the outside was. We can't access this area from the staircase, just as you can't access our area. We made sure it was as private as could be. We thanked Andrea for her hospitality, bid them both good night, and turned in. We had a full weekend ahead of us. There was the writers' convention we came down here for, and an entire festival dedicated to knitting, crocheting, and the like, on top of general tourist things. Lee and I had never been to Tennessee before. Well, I hadn't, she had, but didn't remember it, so it doesn't count. The Airbnb lacked a TV and cell service. We knew this ahead of time and had chosen the Airbnb partially because of that. What better way to disconnect from the world, get some writing done and private time together, than in a house with no cell service. Our first night went smoothly. The food and the long drive left us both drained, and we cuddled comfortably in the clean bed before drifting off to sleep, uninterrupted by phone calls or the ding of social media beckoning. Saturday went by in a hectic daze. The convention went well and Lee made a lot of important connections. Plus, I got to meet some of her online writer friends that have helped her through some tough writing spots. I enjoyed the colorfulness and community feel of the Fiber Crafts Festival. I purchased enough yarn to make a sweater for Lee come winter, a little handmade Tennessee souvenir. When we returned to the Airbnb, Andrea greeted us again and asked us how our day went. We shared with her our altogether pleasant Tennessee experience so far, and she was pleased we had enjoyed ourselves. She offered to bring us out some lemonade while we soaked our feet in the river in front of her home. We accepted graciously and giggled like schoolgirls over how amazing a host Andrea was. The river was well taken care of and clean. Andrea and Robert owned a private mile of the river, and she told us how they painstakingly looked after it every weekend. We could tell how immensely proud Andrea was of her home, and we told her so. She smiled at us and told us they had lived there for 20 years. "It is the safest, most beautiful place I've ever lived," she told us. Robert came home and Andrea left to have dinner with her husband. Lee and I kept our feet in the river, sipping on the delicious lemonade Andrea had made and discussing plans for the rest of the trip. The river water was cool on our hot skin, the stones smooth and slippery from that thin slime water builds up. I called it river snot. Lee had the actual term for it, but I forgot what it was as soon as she said it. We returned Andrea's glasses and lemonade pitcher and returned to the privacy of our half of the house. We played a quick game of Scrabble before Lee pulled out her laptop and started working on her most recent novel. The writers' convention had given her quite a few ideas, and she didn't want to lose them. Lee lightly complained how, without Wi-Fi, she had to make notes in the notepad part of her laptop, instead of in her Google Docs with the rest of her research on the novel. That's what we wanted. I teased her. I kissed her on the head and decided on a bubble bath while she worked. Why not continue to relax? We only had half a day left on the vacation, and then we would have to start the long drive home. The Airbnb had a huge clawfoot tub in the spotless bathroom, and I took full advantage of it, sinking down to my ears in bubbles and steaming water. I stayed in my watery hideaway, daydreaming a little, until the water started to get cold. Lee called out to me just as I was planning on getting out of the tub. She was ready for bed. We crawled into the bed that had been freshly made up for us while we were gone. Something that would have bothered me in any other circumstance because of our privacy, but I wasn't too bothered by it this time. Just Andrea being an extraordinary host again, no big deal. Lee and I drifted asleep almost immediately to the sound of crickets, frogs, and our own breathing. We were wrenched from sleep when a blood-chilling scream came from upstairs. Lee jolted awake beside me, jerking upright. She was always easier to startle than I was. I laid perfectly still, holding her hand in the dark, waiting for any other sounds. We were both positive we heard a scream, and we were both fairly sure it had been Andrea. Without any other sounds for context, we weren't sure if she had stubbed her toe, had a nightmare, or if her and Robert were giving it a go. Even if we thought they were injured, we couldn't get to them, and we had no service to call someone. I had to reassure Lee that we were doing the right thing by going back to sleep. There wasn't anything else we could do. When we see Andrea in the morning, I promised Lee, we'll ask her what the hell that was about. Morning came around, and we were slow to rise. We slept poorly after the scream. Lee tossed and turned, worrying over our decision to not at least go see if everyone was all right, and I couldn't fall back asleep if I had wanted to, which I hadn't. Safest place she'd ever lived or not, Andrea's scream had put me on red alert. Lee and I were in an unknown area, and I wanted to be prepared for the worst. Eventually we roused from bed and got ready for the day. We had a late checkout, 4 p.m., something we had cleared with Andrea weeks ago. She had assured us she would be delighted if we stay another day in Tennessee, the more time to see everything with. She had messaged us. We left the Airbnb, a little shocked to see that Andrea wasn't outside tending to her garden, waiting to see us off. We drove away anyway, a full day of tourist-y things to do before we had to get home. We enjoyed ourselves, even with the unspoken guilt hanging between us. We arrived back at the Airbnb around 3 p.m. We wanted plenty of time to pack and say our goodbyes. When we pulled up, we saw only Robert standing on the porch. He was surrounded by our things. "Robert, what is going on?" I asked him as I stepped out of the car. "Andrea packed for you," he said simply. While I understood going above and beyond, this was a little much, and I was a little angry. That is a bit of an invasion of privacy. Andrea cleared us for a late checkout. I didn't think it would be a problem. I tried. "No problem at all. Happy to help." Robert interrupted me. Lee grabbed my hand and gripped hard. We could both sense that Robert was a little off. "Well, how do we know she packed everything? Can we at least look around the space to make sure nothing was forgotten?" I asked, miffed. Robert grinned at me slowly. The grin felt wrong and inhuman. It didn't reach his eyes, and it surely wasn't a friendly gesture. "No, Andrea is an excellent cleaner, as you can see." He swept his arm out stiffly, indicating to the pristine property. "And even if she missed a tiny item or two, we'll gladly send it back to you, free of charge." "I'm really not comfortable with this," I tried again. Robert interrupted me again. "I'll put these in your trunk for you, and then I hope you ladies have a safe trip." Robert walked robotically to the car and loaded up our suitcases and Lee's laptop bag. She rushed over to the bag, not caring about our host's feelings at this point, and ripped open the case, checking to make sure her precious laptop was safe. Robert returned to the top of the steps and gave us a little wave. "Where is Andrea?" I asked Robert. "We would love to say goodbye. You've both been great." Robert grinned at me again, giving me chills. Lee's hand shook in mine when she came back to my side. "Andrea is resting. She cleaned the entire time you were gone. She gets a little overwhelmed." I saw nothing else we could do. I knew that as soon as I had signal, I would email Andrea to make sure she was all right and thank her for all she had done for us. Robert was acting weird, but Andrea had shown us only kindness. "Thanks, Robert. Thank Andrea for us too," I said simply. I walked Lee to her side of the car and opened her door for her. When she was safely in, I walked to the driver's side. Robert never stopped grinning at me as I did. He kept grinning and waving, standing stiff as a board. We drove away and didn't look back. Lee and I both released our breath in huge gusts when we were a safe distance away. "That was absolutely bonkers," Lee bursted out. I had to agree with her. That was incredibly strange indeed. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the drive. When we got home and had signal, I emailed Andrea as I promised myself I would. It bounced back to me with an error, stating the email no longer existed. I looked for their Airbnb so I could contact Andrea that way. Their Airbnb was gone. "Lee?" I asked her. She was poring through her laptop, making sure nothing was broken or missing. "Lee, their Airbnb is just gone. And any mention of their home in my notes is gone," she told me. She spun the laptop around and just pointed at the screen. I couldn't know what she wrote, of course, but I believed her when she said bits were missing. "What the hell happened down there?" Lee asked me, her voice shaking. "I have no idea." I wish I had answers to soothe myself. I wish I knew what steps to take next. Did we call the police? Tell them that an old guy packed our bags and removed his home from Airbnb? Tell them we didn't see the usually chipper Andrea on our last day? Maybe they should check on her. Lee and I discussed it. We didn't live in the area. We didn't know how the police would react, or if they would even help. Perhaps Robert was just done with Airbnb. Perhaps Andrea really was just overwhelmed cleaning up that big of a property. We would let it go, for now. I checked the local news for that area daily. I figured if anything did happen that was malicious or strange, it would be a while before we heard about it. Robert and Andrea's property was 2 or 3 miles down a gravel road, completely isolated from the other houses in the area. I didn't know if they had friends or living family that visited often. I didn't know anything about them other than what they posted on their Airbnb page, really, and that no longer existed. 4 months after our trip to Tennessee, Lee started planning another vacation. She wanted to use the Airbnb services again. But this time maybe we'd travel west and stay a little longer. She was excited, having forgotten about the weird end to our last Airbnb visit. I tried to share her excitement, but I checked the Tennessee local news again before I agreed to anything definite. There was a small blurb written that made my heart sink. The body of 62-year-old Andrea Witt had been found in the river. When they tried to inform Robert Witt, 65, and question him, they found his body long dead in their home. He died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The note next to him simply said, "I'm tired." There was no other explanation offered for why he suddenly killed his wife and then himself. I have yet to figure out how to tell Lee. She said she's just booked a quaint Airbnb out in Colorado. It was July 2018 when I was on vacation in Tokyo. I booked a nice little cabin from Airbnb. I arrived at the cabin late at night and went straight to bed. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the feeling that I wouldn't be alone. I didn't pay much attention to it because I was really tired because I had just traveled 15 hours to get there. I woke up with a fresh feeling in the morning, despite of all the strange feelings about not being alone I had during the night. I got off the bed, got dressed, switched the lights off, and left to the town for breakfast. I spent a nice day in town exploring the culture and the history of Tokyo. In the late evening, I ordered a taxi back to the cabin. Just when we were arriving at my cabin, the taxi driver started talking to me about something in a very worried tone. I didn't understand anything of it because it was probably in Japanese. I tried to tell him I don't understand anything that he is saying to me, but he just kept on talking. It sounded like he was giving me a warning or something. I went into the cabin, and to my surprise, the lights I had switched off when I left were back on. But again, I was so tired that I didn't pay much attention to it. So I went straight to bed and started sleeping. I was feeling pretty comfortable until I woke up at 3 a.m. to the same feeling of not being alone. But this time I wanted to know why I felt it again. I was so tired that I was barely awake. I was just falling asleep until I saw a red light coming from upstairs. It felt really creepy, but I decided to go there and check where it's coming from. First, I saw nothing, but then I noticed a doll in the corner. I thought that because this is a popular cabin here, that maybe someone had just forgotten it there. I went to see the guest book, if somebody would have written about a doll in there. Bingo, there it was. A little girl with her family had visited here about a week ago, and the little girl had written about having a great time here with her doll. She had even left her phone number there on the book, so I thought I'd just call them in the morning and went back to sleep. When I woke up, I called them that I had found their doll. They, especially the little girl who owns the doll, were really happy to hear that I had found it. They told me that they have been looking for it everywhere, and that they could just come here and get it. And so they did. After that day, I went back to my home. It's about 25 miles from Tokyo. Everything seemed normal first when I got there, until I had this creepy feeling of not being alone again. This was starting to creep me out a lot. I tried to keep it calm, so I went to Facebook. Seeing my friends posting things about their lives has always calmed me. Well, not this time. While I was scrolling it, something really strange came into my eyes in my hometown's group. The same family I had returned the doll to a day ago had disappeared again. The creepy thing about that was that they hadn't visited anywhere during the time it happened. Apparently, I had fallen asleep just after I had read that post, because I saw a dream, or well, I would call it a nightmare, where the doll was in my house's upstairs. I woke up sweating, and I needed to go to the upstairs just to calm myself, that there is no doll there, and that it was just a really terrible nightmare. I made my way there and literally had a heart attack, because there it was. At my house's upstairs. I thought that I was still having the same nightmare, so I slapped myself in the face, just to make sure it wasn't. And it wasn't, because it still was there. I panicked and didn't know what to do, so I called paranormal investigators to my house. When they came, they told me that they can sense a spirit in the doll. I was still panicking and asked them to get rid of the doll as soon as possible. They told me that they would do it, and so they left with the doll. The next day they called me that they go rid of it. I wanted to know how, but they didn't tell me that, which I thought was weird. Everything was starting to panic and creep me out so much, even though the investigators had just called me that they got rid of the doll, that I decided to go to look for support online in this kind of situations. I had been scrolling for a while when I found this paranormal phenomena group. The description says that it's open for everyone who are experiencing paranormal and supernatural things and want to share them with other people who are in the same sort of situations. I found out the location of the group takes place in Tokyo for this week. It was 5 a.m. right now, so I thought I'd go there tomorrow evening. When I woke up, I started driving to Tokyo City. I spent a couple of hours there before the group started. The group took place in an old church. When I went in, I saw there many people from youngsters to elders. The group leader told me that I could be the first one to share my story. I nervously raised my voice and started telling. I was just about to finish when the oldest lady in the group stopped me. She told me something that still sends a chill down my spine. So, here's what she told me. Hello, my name is Emma, and I have lived in Tokyo for 60 years. A lot of horrible tragedies has happened in here during these 60 years. But this one in particular, I think that connects to your story. It happened 11 years ago, and it shocked the whole town. There was a girl named Abigail Takahashi. She was popular for being really kind, caring, and extremely happy girl. She always wanted to help people who needed it the most. The whole town loved her, except for one, her father. The story has it that he was really jealous and angry for her daughter's good reputation, because he was never able to have the same when he was young. So one day, he bought her a doll for an early birthday present. The doll became her everything. Anywhere she went, she always had the doll with her. Despite of the fact that she now had a new best friend, she never stopped caring about other people who needed help. But one day, the town woke up to shocking and heartbreaking news. Her father had murdered her in her sleep 3 a.m. at night. He used his biggest knife as a murder weapon. He was convicted for 10 years in prison. Today, people claim that her doll has her spirit in her. They tell stories that they have seen the doll walking around her grave with a knife, and she seeks revenge in anyone who comes near her. Now, after I heard this, I'm convinced that it's Abigail's doll with her spirit who's with the investigators. It's so terrifying, but I still think it's for best that they got rid of her. There's just one thing I couldn't get out of my mind. Her surname, Takahashi. I swear I've seen that somewhere before. I thought about it for many hours and realized something terrible. The taxi driver. The one that tried to tell me something in a worried tone in the language I didn't understand. His name was Ken Takahashi. I thought about it for a while and thought that it must be just a coincidence. Until I realized that it's been over 10 years from the timing the father went to prison, which means he should be out by now. It was him. The taxi driver was the murderer father. He must have driven the family who forgot the doll there and seen it in with the little girl on the way there. And on the way out, he also drove them away from there and didn't see the doll anymore with the little girl. So he knew that she forgot it there and tried to warn me about it being there. Right now I'm so shocked. I feel like I'm going crazy. I contacted the investigators again, and this time I insisted to know how they got rid of it. Eventually, they told me that they threw it down a well. I convinced myself that I'm safe. There's no doll here anymore. I'm safe. I should stop worrying, and so I did. I started moving on in my life, trying to forget all about those crazy days. Well, needless to say, I will never forget them, but nowadays I can already sleep well and feel safe at my own house. Update. Something is happening to me. I am in a hospital right now. There's cops and doctors everywhere around me. They're telling me that I've been in coma for a couple of months, and that they finally got me awake today. They're asking me a lot of questions. They are all asking the same ones. What happened to you? What do you remember from the night you ended up in here? Do you remember being with anyone that night? I couldn't give them answers. There's only one thing I can remember, but I don't want to tell it, because I'm sure they wouldn't believe me anyway. couple of weeks after the group, I woke up at 3 a.m. I felt the same presence again. I was too scared to get up. I couldn't move. I thought I'm not even going to open my eyes. Well, I did open them eventually, but I definitely shouldn't have. I'll never forget what I saw. The doll was standing there, right in front of me, with a big knife and red glowing eyes. The last thing I remember from that night are 6 words that will always haunt me. My turn to kill, bye-bye. It all started the day we found Charlie's sister in the barn. Erica had returned to our little town from the city to celebrate her 27th birthday. She was sporting a nose ring and had choppy black hair. She had brought her boyfriend Blake with her, with his long black hair and dark wayfarers. Charlie and I were 14 at the time and thought they looked like rock stars. Their parents had arranged a party on the grounds of their property. Charlie and I had our first taste of alcohol that night and coughed our guts up when Erica and Blake let us take drags of their cigarettes. "I love you, Chaz," said Erica, her arms around Charlie and me. "You too, Glenn. Promise me you boys will do whatever makes you happy." We had no idea it was her way of saying goodbye. The next day, there was confusion in the house when Erica and Blake were nowhere to be seen. They'd spent the night in her old bedroom. I'd spent the night on Charlie's bedroom floor. "Did you see your sister leave?" asked his mom. We hadn't. She wasn't answering her cell either. Later that day, Charlie and I went to the barn to look for Erica. When we opened the doors, we saw her lying in the arms of Blake on a bed of straw. We put it down to too much vodka. "We found them," yelled Charlie. "Wake up, sleepyheads." As we got closer, we saw an empty bottle of vodka, along with a small empty pot for high-strength sleeping pills, the kind for prescription only. "Erica," said Charlie, shaking his sister. "She was out cold." "Glenn, she's not breathing." Blake started to stir like he was in pain. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan," I screamed, running out of the barn. Erica and Blake were rushed to the hospital. As feared, Erica was dead at the scene. Blake had his stomach pumped and was put in a ward to recover. She wanted this. He managed through God knows what other drugs they had put him on. "What the F do you mean?" said Erica's dad, grabbing Blake by the front of his smock. He had to be escorted out in tears along with his wife. I sat with Charlie until my parents could come pick me up. We just stared at Blake, this guy who we had thought was so cool, pale with greasy black hair plastered to his face. "She got in, dudes," he said. "What did she get in?" said Charlie, close to tears. "My sister is dead. But she's with them now." He looked up. "Morrison, Joplin, Hendricks." "Who are you talking about?" I said. "Only the greatest to ever live, the 27 Club." He stepped out of bed, wincing, pulling out the tubes in his arms. I still remember the trickles of blood running down his wrists. "What the hell is the 27 Club?" "Strictly members only," he said. "No admittance to anyone even a day before or after turning 27. I turned 2 weeks ago, and we were saving it to go together. Forever 27 with the legends." He walked to the window. "Say, what floor are we on?" I shrugged. "6th, I think." He looked out and turned with a grin. "I bet she's up there partying with Cobain as we speak." He opened the window. "Blake," said Charlie, "I think you should get back in bed." "Forever 27 boys," he said. "See you in a few years." He leapt from the window, making Charlie and I cry out in unison. We heard a gruesome thud as he hit something hard. When I braved a peek, he was face down on the roof of an ambulance. After the events, Charlie became obsessed with the 27 Club. When we turned 16, he wanted to form a Unalive Ourself pact. We would wait until we both turned 27, then end it together. "These people meant nothing to you," I said. "When did you ever talk about the Doors or Jimi Hendrix? And everyone has those Nirvana t-shirts. It means nothing." "It's not just that, Glenn," he said. "It's honoring my sister. You loved Erica too." "I did, but she had problems, Charlie. It's not even a real club. It's not a conspiracy. It's not some amazing club where they're all living it up in paradise. They're unfortunate coincidences. Plenty of other cool people have died at 26 or 28. Before I could react, he pulled out a penknife and sliced open my right palm. I screamed, "Jesus, what the F, Charlie?" He did the same to himself, barely reacted to the pain, then gripped my hand in his. "Forever 27. We're bound by blood now, my brother." "You're crazy," I said, leaving his house. My hand kept slipping on the handlebar of my bike until I got home to patch myself up. Some years passed, and I'd kept my distance from Charlie. I started college and got a new circle of friends. I remember July 23, 2011 like it was yesterday. I was 21. Even before Charlie texted me, I knew he would as soon as I heard the news. Amy Winehouse is dead. She was 27. The scar on my right palm began to ache. I wasn't going to contribute to crazy, so I ignored him. I met with my girlfriend Lori and our group of friends for a night out. Of course, Winehouse was the topic of the evening. She had managed to become a cultural phenomenon in such a short amount of time, and her death was genuinely hard-hitting. And what better way to celebrate the life of a tortured soul than by keeping the drinks flowing and partaking in the coke our friend Shane had scored? "Are you guys familiar with the concept of the 27 Club?" asked Lori. I swallowed my whiskey and cleared my throat. "Yeah, that's an exclusive group of celebrities who croaked it at 27, right?" said Shane. "Exactly," she said. "Anyone who's anyone is part of that club." She held up a glass. "To Amy and the 27 Club." "Hear, hear," said Shane. "May she forever shoot up with my idol, Kurt Cobain, in that big club in the sky." "That's a bit insensitive," I said. "She literally died hours ago. Have some respect." "I'm respecting Buddy," he said. "This is all for her." "Are you okay, Glenn?" said Lori. My palm was burning. I ran a finger over the scar and held it up to them. "I never told you how I got this," I said. "My childhood best friend, Charlie. His sister killed herself when she was 27. Her boyfriend, too." "Shit," said Shane. "Charlie did this to me when we were 16. He cut my hand and made us blood brothers. He wanted me to make an unalive ourselves pact that we would end it at 27. "Glenn, I had no idea," said Lori. "I pushed it away," I said. "I cut all ties with him. But he texted me today, funnily enough, on the day the 27 Club gets a new member." "I feel awful," said Shane. "If I'd known, I wouldn't have." "Look, it's fine," I said. "I'm all for celebrating life or death. I guess I'm just being sensitive. It kind of all came back." A few more years passed. Lori and I were married and had a baby boy, Jack. We lived in a house not a million miles away from where I grew up. One week, I was feeling particularly agitated, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I realized what it was when I spoke to my mom on the phone. "Will you be seeing Charlie for his birthday?" she asked. "I know you boys don't see each other as much as you used to, but you were inseparable once upon a time. I hear it's the big 27. He could probably use the support, what with, well, you know." "I'll message him," I said before saying goodbye. I didn't want to be a prick, so I kept it polite. "Hey Charlie, I wish you a happy birthday. Maybe we can meet for a drink sometime soon. I'm only like 2 hours away from our old town. Love, Glenn." About an hour later, I got a notification. "Glenn, my brother. Thank you for the birthday wishes. I hear you have a little one of your own now." "Me too, little Joseph. I would love to meet for a drink sometime. You stay in touch. Love, your friend Charlie." What was most surprising about it was that he didn't mention his age at all. There was no, "I'm 27 now, and you know what that means." Years of guilt hit me like a sledgehammer to the teeth. I had neglected who was once my most important friend due to an admittedly messed up experience, but clearly one he could have used more support with. I had abandoned him. The scar on my hand burned as if to remind me of the wrong I'd done to him. A few days later, I reached out again. I suggested we meet at one of our old haunts, but he invited me to his home on account of watching his son. He was still based in our old town and had a nice but modest house. Courtesy of the rents, he said. Charlie's parents had done rather well for themselves and owned several properties around town. I'd like you to meet someone. There was a basket perched on a wooden frame, and out he pulled a baby wrapped in a blanket. His little eyes were half open. This is Joseph. Say hello to your Uncle Glenn. He handed Joseph to me, who I awkwardly cradled in my arms until I found the right position. He's the spit of you, Charlie, I said, looking down at his cute little face. He reached up and grabbed my nose with his sharp baby nails. Forgot how much that stings, I said. Jack is currently enjoying his terrible twos. He's a bit of a handful for Lori and myself at times. Come sit down, he said. How is the old ball and chain? I laughed. She's actually perfect. I can't recall a single disagreement we had, other than what to name Jack. She wanted to name him Donald after her grandfather. That wasn't going to happen. He laughed. Where's your better half, anyway? I don't think we ever met. He looked down. Susie, she's no longer with us. It's just little Joey and me. Charlie, I'm so sorry. It wasn't long after his birth. She just didn't wake up one morning. He smiled. We disagreed about his name, too. I wanted to name him Joseph after Joseph Merrick, more commonly known as the Elephant Man. He was the first official member of the 27 Club. I took in a deep breath as I felt unease set in. Charlie, you can't still be obsessed with that club. He reached over and took Joseph from me. Did you hear Anton Yelchin is also a member now? Don't try and tell me it's not real. Okay, I'm gonna leave you to it, I said. Charlie, promise me you'll look after yourself and Joseph. You know where I am if you need any help. Appreciated, he said, laying Joseph down in the basket. Say, isn't your birthday coming up soon? I gulped. Yeah, in a few weeks. Lori and I are having a weekend in the Hamptons. I lied. Ah, good for you, he said. I hope the weather holds out for you. He held out his hand, palm side up, clearly showing me the scar we shared. Put it there, brother. I firmly yet quickly shook his hand and made my way out of his house. He's still not right, I said to Lori later that evening. It's been over 10 years and he's still obsessed with that club. Try to be more sensitive, Glenn. He lost his sister and now his wife too, as well as raising a baby on his own. The poor guy is probably so lost right now. I'm trying, Lori, but that little reminder of my birthday didn't sit right with me. It was like, remember what that means. The thing is, it means nothing to me. I didn't agree to a thing. I didn't ask for this scar. She kissed the top of my head. I'm putting Jack to bed, then taking a bath. Why don't you listen to one of your podcasts? Take your mind off things. Good idea, honey, I said. But not before the tickle monster attacks. I grabbed Jack and blew raspberries on his belly, which sent him into fits of giggles. Okay, that's enough excitement for one day, said Lori. Give me a hug, I said to Jack. Good night, buddy. Night, Daddy, he said, then disappeared upstairs with Lori. I put in my earbuds and started listening to the latest How Bizarre podcast. I was content for all of 10 minutes when I started thinking about Charlie. I opened Google and typed in Charlie Morgan, followed by her hometown. One of the first results was from a local newspaper. The headline was something like, Redacted Man Becomes Single Father After Sudden Tragedy. It mentioned his wife Susie had passed away from breathing complications during sleep. My heart skipped a beat when I read she was 27 at the time of death. I then started to groan as my scar burned as if freshly cut. I knew in my heart Charlie was responsible for Susie's death. I was turning 27 in just over 2 weeks. I called my mom. You sound agitated, sweetheart, she said. What's the matter? Why didn't you tell me about Charlie's wife? I did. I mentioned how he's had a rough go of it in life, but you didn't seem to be interested. Too occupied with childish rivalries or whatever you call it. I felt terrible. I'm sorry, Mother. Did you attend the funeral? I did. Don't worry, I mentioned how busy you were, and you would have been there if you could. Mom, do you think there's any chance Charlie knows where we live? Would that be a bad thing? You were best friends after all. Can you just answer me, please? Yes, he knows where you live. Was I not supposed to tell him during his crisis? Should I have read your mind? No. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm not mad. Look, Lori and I are thinking of going to the Hamptons for my birthday weekend. Would you be able to have Jack? You mean I get to spend the whole weekend with my little Jackie Boo? That was a 100% yes. When Lori came downstairs after her bath, I grabbed her. She let out a little yelp. You haven't made plans for my birthday, have you? No, not yet. I was thinking of having everyone over for a BBQ, bouncy castle for the kids, bucking bronco for the big kids. How about we get away, just the two of us? Go to the Hamptons and rent a romantic cottage on the beach. How bourgeois, she chuckled. Should we rent a garish Lamborghini too? I laughed. If you want. My folks have already said they'll have Jack for the weekend. My birthday came around on a Friday. That morning, Lori drove Jack to my parents, while I finished packing our weekend bags. Lori has already specifically picked out some fancy dresses to show off to the douchebags who summer in the Hamptons. I think she was looking forward to seeing how the other half lived, and making snide remarks behind their backs. I was also in charge of collecting our neon green Lamborghini, which got the whole neighborhood snooping as I pulled it into our driveway. After an hour or so, Lori hadn't returned. I just assumed Mom and Dad were chewing her ears off, so I gave her a call. It went straight to voicemail, so I called my mom instead. Is Lori still with you? I asked. We kinda need to get on the road. No, sweetheart. We haven't seen Lori yet. My heart dropped. She left over an hour ago. Oh my, maybe she stopped for gas or something. For an hour. Don't snap at me, Glenn. There could be traffic. I'm sure she's fine. You're right, I'm sorry. I'll keep trying her cell. Please let me know when she gets to you. My stomach was in knots as I hung up and tried Lori's cell again. 3 hours of calls and texts later, nothing. I kept checking local traffic news to see if there was congestion, or God forbid an accident. Mom, I'm so worried, I said, calling her back. Do you think I should call the police? Oh, sweetheart, I don't think they'd do anything after a few hours. Stay positive. My mind kept going to Charlie. It was my 27th birthday after all. I dialed his cell. Glenn, he answered. Happy birthday, my brother. I could hear the rumblings of an engine in the background. Is this a bad time? I asked. Are you driving? Oh no, it's the perfect time. I'm not driving. But hold on, I'll just put you on to the driver. After a few seconds, I heard her. Glenn, we're okay. We're driving too. It was Lori, but she was cut off short. Okay, that's enough. What the F have you done, Charlie? I spat down the phone. You bring my family back now. Do you know how kind your wife is? He said. She saw me on the side of the road and stopped to give me a ride. Such a sweetie. She told me all about your little birthday getaway, and well, I had to insist on being there myself. I couldn't miss your 27th after all. My stomach was in knots. Please, Charlie, please bring them back to me. I think you should come here, he said. We'll be at the cottage in around 3 hours or so. I heard you have some wheels of your own. Sounds like you'll be traveling in style. Charlie, I pleaded. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for your sister. I'm sorry for abandoning you. Please, just come back to me. Let's talk about it man to man. You'll either be there or not. But if not, I've got another little friend who would love to make acquaintances with Lori and Jack. I heard a click. He has a gun, Glenn, said Lori. I'm coming. Just don't hurt them, Charlie. Please. I'm coming. Good. Oh, and no police and all that shit, of course. You know how it goes. See you later, brother." He hung up. I inhaled a sharp breath and screamed into the house. The first thing I did was collect the handgun we kept on the top shelf of our bedroom closet. Then I went downstairs and spotted a handmade birthday card from Jack on the kitchen counter, with a cupcake next to it. You could see Lori's influence in the words as she had guided his little hand with a paintbrush. "Happy birthday to the best daddy in the world." I fought back the tears, shoved the delicious cupcake into my mouth, and got into that ugly-ass Lamborghini, putting my foot down and raising my middle finger at the neighborhood watch who shook their fists at me. It took me 4 hours to reach the cottage in the Hamptons we'd rented on Airbnb. I put the gun down the front of my pants and walked inside, my heart ready to explode. I was greeted by the smell of rich tomato sauce. Lori was sitting at a dining chair, her hands strapped to the sides with thick twine. Charlie was standing over the cooker, stirring a saucepan. I could see a playpen with Jack sitting up playing with toys, and baby Joseph was lying on his back, waving his arms around. "I'm here," I said, making my presence known. Lori went from looking terrified to mild relief. "Oh, I heard that god-awful car pull up," said Charlie. "Half the neighborhood probably did. You're just in time. I made pasta." "Thanks and all, but I'm not hungry." I went straight over to Lori. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No, honey, I'm fine. Jack's fine too." I kissed her and went over to the playpen. Jack giggled when he saw me, holding up a plastic dinosaur. Joseph clung on to a plush toy of a blue dog. "Don't they look so cute together?" said Charlie. "Brothers from a different mother, just like us." I pulled the gun from my pants and turned to face Charlie. "You're not the Charlie I called my best friend for years. You need help. This obsession has gone on long enough. Tell me, did you kill your wife?" "What?" said Lori from the table. Charlie grinned. "I forget how clever you are. You were always the brains, helping me with homework and stupid math tests that mean absolutely nothing. I loved you, Charlie, but this is too much. So I'm taking my wife, and I'm taking my son. I think under the circumstances we'll be taking Joseph too. I sincerely hope you get the help you need so one day he can have a relationship with his dad." I walked over to Lori, but she yelled out, "Wait." Charlie started to laugh. "Did you think it would be that easy? Just look inside her blouse." I peeked inside and saw an electronic device strapped to her chest. It had a numerical display that was counting down. There were 46 minutes remaining. If she moves from that spot before the timer runs out, a shot of adrenaline will be pumped into her heart. We're talking about an insane amount of adrenaline. Enough to knock out an elephant. She simply won't make it. "What do you want from me?" I yelled. He walked towards me and took the gun from my hand, putting it on the table. Then he held up his scarred palm and held it against mine. That burning sensation came back. "I want us to share a bottle, then live up to our pact." "But I didn't make the pact," I screamed. "You forced it on me." "Come on, Glenn. We owe this to my sister and to Blake. To Basquiat, Winehouse, Morrison, Cobain, Joplin. To all those legends." "You're insane," I said, pushing him against the wall. "Careful. All it takes is one little click, and Lori's heart goes boom, and little Jack and Joey will be left orphans. You're actually going to take your own life with your baby boy right there." He nodded. "I've been committed to this since I was 14 years old. If you do exactly what I say, Lori lives. She can take Jack and Joey and be the hero of the story. Now, I checked your birth certificate. You were born at 2119, which is when you'll officially turn 27. Lori's heart device will become useless at 2130, at which point she can wriggle out of those ropes and get out of here. But not before we've taken a special concoction I've made to honor my sister." My legs went weak, and I had to sit down on the floor. "You actually want me to end my life with you?" "Forever 27, Glenn. You'll thank me when we're living it up." "Don't do it, honey," said Lori. "Yeah, that's not an option," said Charlie. You see, if he refuses, I'll put a bullet in his head. Then I'll watch as your heart explodes." I started to cry. I felt so weak, so powerless. But I think the worst thing of all was that Charlie was my friend. We'd been estranged for years, but he was my friend. "May I kiss my wife?" I asked. Of course, I'm not a monster. I stood up and walked over to Lori, gently hugging her. I could feel the metallic device against my chest as I kissed her. "Don't do this," she said, tears streaming. "I love you, Lori. Look after our boy." I went over to the playpen and picked up Jack, who looked so oblivious to everything. "Dada," he said, gently patting my face. "I love you, Jack," I said, kissing his cheek. He wiped his cheek like it was the most disgusting thing he'd experienced. "Look after Mama." I reached down and stroked little Joseph's face. "I wish things could have been different for you, little one." "All right, we get it," said Charlie. "Outside now." Despite the disturbing situation I found myself in, the night was beautiful. A dinner table had been set up on the deck behind the cottage. There was a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. The moon was low, the temperature mild, the sounds of the ocean gentle. It was supposed to be me and Lori enjoying a meal and maybe a spot of love making on the dunes like we were teenagers again. "Sit down," he said. "I've waited weeks for this. I almost did it without you, but my scar burned like a mother F. Do you ever get that?" I shrugged as I sat down. "Yeah, you do. It's because we're connected." He poured 2 whiskeys and pushed one towards me. I didn't hesitate, downing it in one go, shuddering a little at the afterburn. "That's good shit," I said. "It's gotta be the best," he said. "It's a 10-year-old single malt." I pushed out my glass for another, which he obliged. "Suppose I'd better catch up." He downed it and checked his watch. 21:15. Now's as good a time as any. He pulled out a glass vial from his pocket containing a clear liquid. "This is a highly concentrated mix of Zaleplon, Valium, Klonopin, and ethanol." He opened it and poured half into my glass and the other half into his. "The beauty is we'll probably be asleep before any of the nasty side effects take hold." I took a deep breath and downed some whiskey straight from the bottle. "Gimme that," he said, and did the same. He then pulled out his gun and placed it on the table. I could feel tears streaming down my face. "You were my brother, Charlie," I said. "How could you do this to me?" "Because I love you," he said. "You and I forever 27. I can't think of anything more beautiful than that." He looked at his watch again and beamed. 21:19. "It's officially your birthday, Glenn. Welcome to 27. Oh, how I've waited for this. Please, Charlie, think of Jack. Think of Joseph. He needs his daddy." He picked up the gun. "Drink it." I picked up the glass and swirled the clear mixture around. The smell was like pure alcohol. Then I looked to the sky, the moon, the stars, and the ocean. "To Lori and to Jack," I said, downing the mixture. It burned like freshly boiled water as it went down, making me clutch my throat. As soon as it reached my stomach, it was like a sucker punch to the gut. I stumbled off the chair and fell to the ground, clutching my belly. "I'm coming, brother," said Charlie, picking up his glass. But before he could take a sip, a gunshot sounded out. I heard the glass smash on the ground and had enough time to see a single trickle of blood drip down his forehead before he collapsed. Then I passed out. A week later, I was awake in a hospital bed. It turns out my wife is a genius. She figured out that if she could force something between her chest and the adrenaline shot, she'd be able to move freely. So while Charlie and I were sitting outside, Lori freed her hands. Charlie was no expert when it came to knots, apparently, and wedged a dinner plate against her chest. When the device activated, it shattered the plate, causing a small cut to her chest, but otherwise leaving her unharmed. She then used my gun, which Charlie had left on the table, to shoot him in the head. It wasn't a fatal shot, though, just enough to render him unconscious. He was being kept on a different floor in the hospital. On the day of my release, I went to see him. He had tubes coming out of his arms, mouth, and thighs. Despite what he's put me through, It gave me no pleasure to see him that way. We've become temporary guardians to Joseph Morgan, Charlie's son, though we're fighting for custody. Charlie's parents, who are his next of kin, are really too old to be looking after a baby. We always said we wanted 2 kids, and he's as sweet as pie. Jack has taken a shine to him, too. Charlie remained on life support. There was always a police officer sitting outside his room, but I visited regularly. He could sometimes communicate with his hands and eyes. Speech was usually slurred, but I know in my heart he used every fiber of energy left in his body to communicate with me on one special day, the day before he turned 28. I was reading Of Mice and Men to him. It was a book we'd studied at school and had meant a lot to us at the time, having got us both B grades on our assignments. Mid-speech, I was interrupted by his hand on my wrist. He gripped it tighter than I thought he could. I looked into his eyes, my breath frozen. They were wide, pleading. There were already several birthday cards dotted around the room reminding him of what was about to happen. Plea. His lips parted to try and speak. I could see tears forming in his eyes. I put the book down and leaned closer. Charlie, what is it? Glenn, you have to. I knew what he wanted to say. Charlie, please don't ask that of me. Please, he said. Forever. 27. I looked around the room. It was empty, but the door was open. A cop was sitting outside like usual. I stood up and slowly closed the door, wedging a chair under the handle. I went back to Charlie. Are you sure? I asked. He lifted a trembling hand to my face and nodded. I'm sorry, brother. I started to cry as I kissed his cheek. Then I found the mains plug, pulling it out of the wall. I held his hand as he started to convulse, and alarms started sounding through the halls. The cop was knocking on the door, trying to force himself in. By the time the cop and 2 nurses had got into the room, Charlie was dead. His parents took me to court. I spent 6 months in prison before the judge dismissed the case. Charlie got his wish. He became a member of the 27 Club. I hope it's everything he wanted it to be. Edit. For those who don't understand why I did what I did, Charlie was my best friend for a lot of years. One final act of kindness felt right to me, regardless of what he'd done to me. I wouldn't even want to see my worst enemy kept alive with wires and synthetic breathing apparatus.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.